Hello and welcome to the News Uncut podcast. I'm Jasmine Birtles, and today I'm joined by Baroness Claire Fox, who is the founder of the Academy of Ideas, which also produces the Battle of Ideas. And Claire is very much a champion of free speech. Claire, thank you very much for joining me.
It's a great pleasure.
So, Claire, we spoke about free speech and the problems facing free speech last year. How do you see things have moved on? Have things improved or have they worsened, would you say, from the situation we were in last year?
So I think that one positive to start with is that there's much more public awareness of the idea that free speech is not something we can take for granted any longer. I think that there's been something of a cut through where people, rather than walking on eggshells and feeling very nervous and thinking that nobody knows that you can't say what you want or that somebody will say you can't say that, increasingly there is a discourse, a discussion and a narrative from grassroots campaigners on all types of issues that actually there's real restrictions on what you can say, a climate in which you are nervous, but that in and of itself is a bit of a victory, because if you recall, I mean, even last year people would say cancel culture. What cancel culture? It doesn't exist. Whereas now people know exactly what you mean. So that's the positive. That's, I'm afraid, might be as far as it goes. On the positives, the negatives are that we are not in a situation where the authorities are sensitive about attacking free speech. Their confidence has just grown. There is no sense in which people in positions of power hold back from, ensuring that certain views are not heard in the public realm. Where it's tricky is that the techniques of silencing or of ensuring that views aren't heard are potentially more subtle and take a wide range of rather insidious forms, and as a consequence of which sometimes you're not really even sure if you have been cancelled, but suddenly that view is not heard. So that is disconcerting. In the UK, we've got a new government, and although the new Labour government, with an enormous majority, even if with a rather shallow and thin grasp of the popular vote, they aren't kind of like gung-ho, now we're even going to censor everyone by any stretch of the imagination. They're much more interested in more technocratic matters of, getting spades in the ground and building and housing and infrastructure projects. And there's all sorts of interesting things to say about that. But on the other hand, I'm afraid the Labour government have also got very little instinct when it comes to protecting freedoms. I mean, they're much more inclined to be illiberal on free speech matters because they're associated with a more social justice agenda. And in the context of protecting the vulnerable and protecting different identity groups, I think are going to be a huge threat to free speech as we move forward.
As you say, the subtlety is the concern, because of course we can see that the mainstream media is sort of more left of centre on the whole, apart from the obvious ones, but even the obvious ones I think are much more left than they used to be. But when it comes to social media, there are very subtle ways in which people's voices and opinions can be simply dampened down. And as you say, you don't even know. And this is something I think with News Uncut, with our Twitter feed, for example, we notice that quite a lot of our posts are ignored. And this is what they call shadow banning, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Twitter is a very interesting case because on the one hand, it has been something of a refreshing change to have a social media company like X, led by Elon Musk, who have explicitly said we are anti-censorship, and in the fight against particularly online censorship, which has come in the form of a range internationally of online safety legislation. It's taking different forms in different countries. We've seen that Elon Musk and X have stood out against that. Most recently, the European Union have been, it's been revealed by the likes of Michael Schellenberger and others that the European Union have done deals with the big tech companies to remove content that they consider to be misinformation. And by the way, that's one of the shifts that things are removed on the basis that they're misinformation, that they're factually inaccurate, that somebody's decided that they're not information that the public can be trusted with because it's untrustworthy information. Mm-hmm. So it's like they're doing a public service. However, Elon Musk has spoken out against that. But you are also correct that if you use X, you'll sometimes feel that you are being shadow banned. You know, that there are times when things just don't get the attention that you might have anticipated they would get, or that would normally get, and it's sometimes topic related. So, you know, for me, there are certain issues that just are less likely to get picked up. Now, this is the difficulty. Is it the case that the public are just not interested in what you, Jasmine, writes about, right? I mean, you know, no, if I know that there is some concern in some, you know, activists that continued attention on, you know, the consequences of lockdown or you know, maybe vaccine harms or COVID are no longer getting any traction in social media. Is that because the public have moved on? You know, they're just not interested. And so I don't know the answer. I'm not saying, because there are tweets that I put out that just don't go anywhere, and then others that like go viral within, and I'm like, why is that gone? It's not even that interesting. What happened there? And we don't, of course, know, because we've got no proof, because something like a shadow ban isn't always obvious to us, right? But there is also much more evidence, and this might well be algorithmic, but they can be set by real individuals with real interests. You know, that you lose a lot of followers, and then people. I've only had a spate recently of people contacting me saying, "I followed you for years, and now I'm not following you. I don't know what happened." And so you can get stuck, which is that people don't follow you. But the untangling whether you're being paranoid, you're less popular, or whether there's an official ban are quite difficult. And you don't want to sound like you're you know, saying, "Oh, I can't understand why nobody likes me." So that's what I mean about there's some more insidious things that go on. And but we can be pretty sure that you cannot say that it's just a level playing field. You know, that you post something on a social media site and it gets no interest. You can no longer rely on the fact that you'd think, "Oh, that's because that just didn't land. It's got no public interest," because you're suspicious that there are things going on in the background that stop it getting seen by people. People just saying, "I never even saw you posting that," and so on and so forth. But I think that's one technical problem. I think on a you know what we do know basis, the Labour government have just been lobbied by all of the children's charities. I think there's 23 of them that have told the new government that their online safety bill is not doing enough to protect children. And the online safety bill in the UK was explicitly supposed to be about protecting young people from online harms, even though that was only 20% of the total bill in truth. But anyway, there's now complaints that it's not doing enough. The Labour government straight away have said, "We're going to build on the online safety legislation to ensure tighter controls," and so on. Now, because when it comes to children, there's a different attitude from even the most free speech absolutists like myself. You know, children are not adult citizens, and therefore there is a different approach that one would have. You might think, "Oh, well, that's okay. You know, I trust the government," but they then start saying, "We're going to bring in more explicit age verification and so on in order to protect children." That actually did not go entirely into the legislation as is. And the government now have got a piece of legislation, as they say, that they can build on. And if you have explicit mandated age verification for children, that obviously means you've got to have it for adults, because in order to distinguish between the 13-year-old and the 30-year-old, if it's to be mandated, then you're going to have to check the age of people. And that's something which, even though the discussions on online safety bill which I was opposing were pretty illiberal, even the government of the day were kind of nervous of age verification for adults. Labour government, oh, don't worry, we'll sort it out. We've got the law now, we can build on it. And that's the other thing that I'd say is a more subtle threat, which is when you've got a piece of legislation, you don't necessarily need to change the law to change that legislation. The legislation can be then the bedrock in which you can tinker with the law through guidance, through statutory instruments, through ways that are not as obvious to scrutinise or hold to account. It's the relationship between the government and Ofcom, which is exactly how they responded to the children's charities. We'll talk to Ofcom, we'll advise them that they must do more. Ofcom is then a huge regulator with enormous powers, not answerable to anyone, who can be changing the way that online censorship or curtailment of speech can happen, but they don't need any longer a new law. They can just use the wide parameters of a piece of legislation to get that through.
So that means, it's the way you're saying this, that sounds to me that we are quite quickly going towards digital ID and having to have an ID to access the internet, I'm assuming.
Well, so I think digital ID is a tricky one because, well, first of all, we don't know what the form will take, what form it will take. I know there's great concern over digital ID, and I don't want to preach complacency, but there is also some wariness of digital ID explicitly from all political parties, because sometimes there are certain red lines even for them. So just to use the example, Tony Blair, every year, the Blair Foundation comes out and says we're going to have digital ID, right? Mm-hmm. And every year, the government in charge says, no, we're not. You know, he kind of nags, they say no. I don't suggest that digital ID is not something to be wary of or to look out for or to consider the trends. But there is no enthusiasm for digital ID, it seems to me, in the UK from the authorities. The kind of show us your papers, please society, which we obviously are very aware can be just around the corner, as we could see that from lockdown and from the idea of things like vaccine passports and so on. I don't think is an immediate threat. But of course, access to public services via, more digital friendly mechanisms, all of these things point in a certain direction. But I don't think it's an explicit desire for them to have digital ID checks on people, despite what Tony Blair wants. They immediately just said no to that. And I think they meant it, but it can be something to just keep your eye on what's happening.
And what about access to the internet? Do you think, I mean, it's not quite digital ID, but do you think if they do bring in age verification, that could be the start of restricting access to the internet unless you register, unless you pay for this, that, and the other?
Well, I mean, we've all got to be honest about it. We live in a digital world. We're doing this over Zoom. That will mean that we have verified ourselves somewhere along the lines. We can wail and rail against changes, but in order to access life, you have to digitally identify yourself one way or another. From buying Amazon presents to looking on all of the live streaming sites and what have you. So the difficulty is that we all depend on a digital world, And that does mean, and I'm not a Luddite, and I understand that this is generally speaking a positive thing. I don't want to have to only use cash all the time. I'm not aiming for a cashless society. I understand the risks of that, but we have got used to it. In other words, we have accepted that new world in order to carry on anyway. So I don't want to be naive and say, will they force us to do certain things? I'm simply saying that something as seemingly benign as saying, let's protect children and we want to make sure that children who are young can't get access to this, hardcore porn or what have you, has it built into it the possibilities of, and the fact that the government minister just sort of said, don't worry, we'll sort it out, he didn't say how, would indicate that they haven't got the instinct to be nervous about the fact that that could have implications for adult ID. In other words, I don't think they're explicitly trying to do that. I think censorship is much more, as I said, which is that the governments around the world have apparently attacked big tech and said, you are too powerful. And we are going to bring in a series of pieces of legislation taking different forms everywhere that get you in line, that make sure that you do not have this total freedom of the public square. And you've got to be responsible for what people see and what people read and so on. And so the irony is that in order to take big tech down a peg or two, they've actually given them a huge amount of power to be responsible. And that's exactly what the Online Safety Act did in the UK, is that the government don't censor anything. They simply said, you big tech must do that or we'll fine you. We'll hold you criminally negligent if you don't. And so they've outsourced the decision-making to big tech firms. They've then told them you must make sure that, that there's no hateful content that's going to upset people visible. So you've got to empower the user to be able to filter what they see, but immediately you're giving them the tools through which they, big tech, will decide what's acceptable in that public square. And some of the big tech companies are more enthusiastic about that. And then we also know that the government, through having this relationship with big tech companies, will say, why don't we work together sometimes on, we'll tell you, for example, what the acceptable health advice or guidance is on this particular drug, and then if anyone doesn't go abide by that, that can be dubbed as misinformation and harmful. And so it's never a straightforward census charter ever.
Speaking of which, we've talked about sort of the right, or being censored quite often. That seems to be the trend at the moment, that it's right-wing ideas are being censored. But I'm hearing from friends who could be described as hard left, far left, that they're being censored as well. Are you seeing this? Do you feel that it's a centrist position, that anything outside of right or left of the centrist position is being censored more than any other types of views?
So I'm not a great believer in, I think the left-right labeling doesn't work so easily these days. I mean, myself. I think that I don't know that it's centrist. I just think that if you've got a kind of an atmosphere which says that the problem is extremism, then which is kind of the narrative at the moment, that the extremism is a threat, then you've got a situation in which that's a very subjective term potentially. And although some of the issues that we've discussed are, maybe associated with the right, but if you take gender critical views, for example, and people who are sex realists and insist that a man who wants to be a woman isn't a woman, you'll know that that's often a grassroots campaign that's been led by left, historically left-leaning feminists, and then they're called right-wing culture warriors. So the left-right labels don't work. I'll tell you one thing that's concerning me, and as a kind of new threat to free speech, which is not the state, is what we're doing to each other, which is tit for tat cancel culture is a real problem, and this has just really come through in America at the moment. So what's happening in America since the attempted assassination of Donald Trump is that a completely not just tasteless but horrible posts have emerged of people, quite prominent people, on associated with Democrats or critics of Donald Trump and the Republican Party, have maybe said sorry the bullet missed, or what I mean, get better at shooting practice, or all of this kind of stuff, right? Some of them might be tongue in cheek, some of them downright vicious and almost willfully wishing that the assassination had happened, right? I mean, terrible. You can say all sorts of things you want, right? But the response of some very prominent Trump supporters and of some very big accounts on social media has been to dox and expose those people. And in some instances, this has been ordinary people. So there's a couple of examples of they've tracked down some woman who worked in a popular shop who said something who was filmed saying something of that nature when she was on the checkout till, and they've got her sacked. People calling for people to be sacked, and this is like developed something of a speed, and people are being sacked. And the reason I'm drawing attention to that is because one of the danger, and then this is cancel culture, by the way. That is exactly, it's the playbook of cancel culture. You identify someone saying the wrong thing, you go to their employers, you demand that they're sacked. Sacked. You shame them on social media. You lead a Twitch hunt. Now, in the row that's occurring about whether this is good or a bad thing, you could say somebody like me, or and other prominent free speech people in America are being accused of being called centrist dads for saying you actually have to hold the line and say you don't deploy the tactic of cancel culture against anyone, even if they're saying things that you think are absolutely vile. Don't say, oh, they're vile, but they're harmful, because as soon as you start saying that the speech is harmful, you fall into the trap of saying, oh, so harmful speech should be banned then. That this is extremist, or that it's stirring things up. Now, you suddenly find yourself in a situation, which is what's going on if you look at a kind of American free speech Twitter, where the big free speech accounts are under attack from Trump supporters. I'm not saying Donald Trump, but Trump supporters who are saying they deserve everything they get. They tried to cancel us, and we are now enjoying. We're now going, not enjoying, but there's a sense of enjoying. We're going to get them, and they deserve everything they get. Now, I say that because at the beginning I said that one of the things that had happened is that cancel culture had cut through. People now understand that cancel culture exists, whereas it used to be denied that censorship was even happening. Now we've got into a situation whereby the playbook and the narrative exists, and there is a really serious danger that rather than saying we won't tolerate cancel culture, that we start thinking that it's a useful tool in the armory of free speeches, or for the campaigns or political positions that we agree with. And I think that's something that is very nerve-wracking, and we should be very wary of.
Yeah, very good point. I didn't know that was happening, and that's pretty serious. It just shows you've got to stick with principle, however much it might hurt, and however much it might go against what you particularly enjoy and feel is right at the time. You've got to stick with principle. And on that point, what do you feel that we as individuals can do to promote free speech, to protect it? I hate to use the word protect, actually, because it sounds like, again, it's a word that's being used wrongly, but to defend free speech. What can we as individuals do, particularly when we feel a bit helpless?
Well, I think that sense of solidarity is very important, because I think we have to have a consistent solidarity across the board and keep pointing out that it's a principle, and it's a principle that you can't guarantee will be there forever, that it's quite fragile. It's a very precious right, freedom of speech. It's not a natural right. It had to be fought for, and although it's not constitutionally in the law, I mean, I'm not saying it's a right like that. It's something which every generation has to renew its arguments around and not assume. And we particularly know that young people, Generation X, Gen Zers, Millenniums, whatever, there's a more ambivalent. They haven't got the tradition of even knowing that this is an important right for them to have. So we have to do that. And a sense of solidarity can change things, because I think if you feel that you're not alone, that really makes a difference. And so if there are prominent individuals who are consistent on free speech, that's very important. And it's one of the reasons why we organise the Battle of Ideas Festival, to kind of like almost attract people from a wide range of political and social backgrounds across left and right and all the rest of it, but whose common denominator is that they respect the free speech of other people and are prepared to say, oh, I'll listen to what somebody with a different opinion says, and I'm not going to just kind of say I find that offensive and flounce off or try and get them sacked, as we've just said. So that's very important. Now, I'm going to say a negative, which is one thing I'm wary about what's happening at the moment is that a lot of people in the fight for free speech are trying to use the law to defend themselves. And they're particularly trying to use the 2010 Equality Act, which has got within it protected characteristics, and trying to turn that into and say that opinions and views are a protected characteristic. So there's a great deal of lawfare going on, and this is partly being initiated by something called the Forstater case, which is Maya Forstater, who's a brilliant woman who's a co-founder of Sex Matters. But she won her case where it was said that she was discriminated against because she had gender critical views. She was discriminated against by her employer, and she won that case, and that became the Forstater sort of judgment. Now, the reason this sounds a bit burbly, but there is a danger we try and use the law and lawfare to protect free speech. But it seems to me, I don't want to become restricted to a situation where you have to go to the law courts to say that my speech is protected speech and that I'm allowed to have these controversial views because the law said it. I mean, that's like getting permission from the law, right? And sorry, no. The point about free speech is that any speech is acceptable, right? The contentious bit is when speech, and there is obviously a red line which we can all see, turns into threats, intimidation, incitement, but that's at the very far end of what that would mean, which is rather than just saying horrible things like, God, I wish you'd go off and die, is not the same as saying, I'm going to ensure you die, and I know your address, and I'm coming around tomorrow at 9 o'clock. You know what I mean? Like you have to have those distinctions. I think that depending on the law is too narrow. If you look at the moment, there's so many employment tribunals going on where people are using the law to defend their speech because they maybe feel that they've been discriminated against work for having lawful views. But if we only get stuck in that lawfare place, then we give far too much power to the authorities to decide what those lawful views can and can't be. And I think we should be wary of that. When you ask what else we can do, I think that we should champion cases. We have to take them up and do what you're doing, which is, have an eagle eye on what's happening. Try and look at what's being brought in through the law or through the back door or the trends in society. Because, why do they censor? They censor because they know that information is power, right? Yeah. Well, therefore, the more information people have, the more power they have. One of the things is not quite knowing what's happening. So the more that we can expose, not in a kind of obsessively conspiratorial way, but where you just say, look, what we found out that's not obvious, and you can now know about this, do with it what you will. But I think that's the way that you don't feel as though you're constantly a victim of censorious trends and you don't know what's going on. And so I gather as much information, reports, and newspaper articles, and follow accounts that I know are reliable free speech advocates and so on and so forth. So that's what I do.
Speaking of which, we'll just finish with your Substack and what you're sending out, because as you say, it's important to be informed. I know you write about free speech. What is it? It's a Substack, I think. How can people access it and sign up to it?
Yeah, so it's academyofideas.org, I think is the I'm sorry to be so vague, but we just slightly changed the name of it. But if you were to search Claire Fox Substack or Academy of Ideas Substack, you will get us, right, one way or another. You will, yeah. And it's, by the way, 90% of it's free, and we put out 3 or 4 posts a week, including me doing a kind of inside the Lord, so you get a behind the scenes look at how legislation is made. But we have lots of guest Substackers. We have a lot of guest writers, I mean, and we find people really love it, right? We've got a paid section, but we're very keen to use Substack, or I know that lots of people use Substack, but as much of a Substack community as can be built up, because you can recommend each other's Substack.
Yeah.
I read as widely as possible from Substack now, because I think that there's some fantastic journalism going on. I don't want to abandon mainstream media at all. I mean, I know that people will say MSM, I don't trust them. Jasmine, you still write for mainstream media sometimes. We both go on TV when we're invited, or on radio stations. But building an alternative media is one of the most crucial things that we can do, which is what you're trying to do, what we at the Academy of Ideas are trying to do, where you give people choices. You no longer now have to watch the BBC News and believe it as truth. You can read around and say that BBC report of what happened to Donald Trump, by the way, this is because it's true, was brilliant and accurate, and we got some fantastic journalism out of it. But I'm not dependent on watching the BBC News to find out the truth.
No.
I'm not so cynical that everything I see on the telly I don't agree with, but I can now get some depth. And so the Substack community to me has been a liberation, because they're not affected by algorithms. Getting the word out about our Substack is, because as soon as you put a Substack post up on X or Twitter, the intertech rivalries,
Yes,
algorithms do some damage to you.
we've noticed that. Yeah.
But Substack itself, you control your own audience. And so if it's free to sign up to people's Substacks, or even if you have to pay a bit of money for some Substacks, I think it's a worthwhile investment. So that's a very positive thing that people can do.
Great. Well, thank you, Claire. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Baroness Claire Fox. Really helpful to get an update on free speech, and I look forward to doing another update next year.
I hope it's better news.
Quite. Thanks so much, Claire.